Hi, do you see and hear me now?
I see you. I hear you. I appreciate you. You are seen.
Oh,
You are loved. You are cared.
thank you. You're too kind. Okay, so this video is the Aryan invasions, and it's funny that this is a historic event that goes back thousands of years, and it's one of the most important historic events in history. But over the course of the 20th century, there was basically this huge academic conspiracy to pretend it never happened. And it's funny that an event of this scale, that there was a concentrated effort to really wipe it out. And it was only in the 21st century that we confirmed it actually happened through a bunch of different things. But still, Indian nationalists claim it didn't happen. And the reason I don't study prehistory, the reason that this is the history podcast, History 102, not Prehistory 102, is for reasons that we will gradually see over this episode. That the sources I'm using for this historic event are basically all linguistics or archaeology or stuff that can change. While for the other historic events, we have for the last 1,000 years, you can generally get records from every single side involved. For the 100 Years' War, the American Civil War, every side involved, we have records of their perspective. But for this, we're basically just looking at genetics and linguistics, and there are the Aryans ended up hitting up against some historic societies, but it's really remarkable that something this big can happen, and we don't know that much about it. And it really begs the question, we found this through genetics especially, that there were huge events in prehistory that we're only just discovering now due to genetics. And the world's really a funny place. This is on the edge of recorded history, where let's say there's a veil between recorded history and prehistory. And this exists right on the veil. It's right on the edge for what we have records on. And also, histories until pretty recently purposely left this out, because for the Aryan invasions, it obviously was associated with the Nazis. And so I call it the blue pill era. The blue pill era is 1960 to like 2020. And there were a series of completely incorrect beliefs that were pushed in the blue pill era. One of which is that men and women are the same, that progress is innate, that genetics doesn't affect society, that culture doesn't matter. There's like 12 of these. And so part of the blue pill era was saying that prehistoric peoples were peaceful and that there was no migration in the prehistoric world. That was something people believed for decades, that people just migrated out of Africa. They sat in their place and then no one moved into each other's place for 100,000 years. And that's just completely ridiculous. It makes no sense. And now we've had a tremendous amount of research that tribal people waged warfare, but there was a period where you weren't allowed to talk about tribal warfare in academia. And so the irony that we found through just studying the topic is that tribal people have a lot of warfare. It kills between 20 to 30% of their male population every generation. And on top of this, what we found through genetics is that migrations and tribal genocide is completely normal. The population of Europe was genocided at least 7 times during the last ice age and is replaced each time. And so what happened with the Indo-Aryan invasions is that it was just completely taboo to talk about in academia. And so only now are we in the sort of place where we can reconstruct a narrative about what it was about, because it pushed up against too many sacred cows that academia didn't want to talk about. And also because academia for the blue pill era had Nazi derangement syndrome. Even something that's adjacent to the Nazis, we had to pretend it never happened. Where the Nazis were using false racial science to say that they were the true Aryans, and they were using this as their narrative to basically justify the colonization and genocide of Eastern Europe. And so academia went through a derangement syndrome that only now do we have the information to put this story together.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's a good
Yeah.
explanation. So we
Um,
want to take us through it?
yeah, sure thing. So let me start with when this event. Let me start with explaining the sheer scope of the Indo-Aryan invasions, and then from that we can backtrack to explain how they happened. Where Indo-European language, and actually, I need to go through the terminology first. This is one of those things that's been obfuscated through purposeful misuse of terminology. So, there's a bunch of names you could use here. You've got Proto-Indo-European, which the acronym goes to PI. I could never understand why academia made an acronym called PI, and no one made jokes about it or pointed it out or anything. So there's Proto-Indo-European. There's Indo-Aryan. So the Proto-Indo-Europeans were the Western branch of this. They're the people who conquered into modern Europe. Then you have the Indo-Aryans, and they were the ones that went down into India and Iran. They're also called the Yamnaya and the Kurgan, and for each of these, they're archaeological terms for very specific things. And the problem is that when you have too many academics and not enough public historians, is that terms get unnecessarily autistic for silly reasons. Where I was arguing with a geneticist, and I was talking about steppe ancestry, because the area the Indo-Europeans are from is called the steppe. And so I was saying steppe ancestry is the same thing as Aryan ancestry. And he said, no, steppe is this genetic subcomponent from Siberia that went into the Aryans. And I just thought, can you make a new term? I mean, these terms are so weird and complicated that for a normal person, it doesn't really make sense. And so, as the only public intellectual who has entered this field, I get to determine how these things get I get to make up the terms now. No one else has done it before me. So I'm just going to call them all Aryan, because Aryan was the term that was used before World War II. And academia was purposely making the terms hyper complicated because they didn't want to have to deal with the Nazi discussion. But World War II was nearly 100 years ago. So I think we've aged out. Almost everyone involved in that conflict is dead. And so, for my opinion, we've aged out where we can remove the derangement about terminology. And Aryan was a term, it's been in use since the 18th century. And it's actually no, it's been in use since 2000 BC, because it's an Aryan is Sanskrit for noble, and it was a term for their nobility. And then it was co-opted by Nazis. No, sorry, it was first taken in by European linguists who found that there were similarities between because the British were colonizing India. They found there were linguistic similarities between the Indian languages like Hindi and Sanskrit and Latin and Greek, and then later English and French. And so in the 18th century, they were looking at these linguistic similarities from India to Europe, and they found that there had to be some underlying cultural event where these sorts of things don't just happen. And this is an interesting debate in anthropology where you'll find certain things like very similar myths in Mexican society as Chinese society, or you'll find these uncanny similarities in architecture or in philosophy. So the question anthropologists always get into is, do these things spread by people carrying them and by the ideas, or are these their underlying archetypes in human thought and human behavior? And so I was reading Joseph Campbell, who was a big anthropologist of like the World War II era, and he was talking about how these similarities in mythology and architecture between the Mexicans would have had to have stemmed from people from the Middle East sailing to Mexico. And I think because his worldview didn't factor in, my personal opinion is that there are probably these underlying archetypes inside human psychology, which is why you keep on seeing like dragon myths or certain types of architecture repeated in different societies. That very interesting digression aside, with this division between do humans evolve similar ideas independently, organically, or do they spread by groups of people migrating, is that with the Aryan linguistic similarities, they are very clearly the same group of people. And we've traced this migration to around 2000 BC. And so for a frame of reference, that's very recent. It's funny when a historian says recent, I call the 1600s recent. And so as a historian, you can't say 2000 BC is recent. If you're in prehistory, you can, where, we are closer to T-Rex than T-Rex was to Stegosaurus. There's this whole genre of like deep time things where they say, yeah, the Earth is. I have a friend who says that the universe is 14 trillion years old, and he's studied a tremendous amount of. He's a very sharp guy. You might know him actually. He studied a tremendous amount of that sort of science and that sort of thing. I don't know if that's true, but if the universe, these people say the universe is 14 billion years old. And life has only been around for 1 billion years. So time is a very big thing. Everything we know and love is in a very small sliver of time. And so 2000 BC, when the Aryan invasions were happening, the pyramids were already nearly 1,000 years old. And there were 1,000 years of civilization in Mesopotamia already. Agriculture had already been around for 8,000 years. And so it's a remarkable... The pyramids are so old. I have to read a couple of books before we make the ancient Egypt episode, but so we are closer to Cleopatra than Cleopatra was to the building of the pyramids. And the Aryan migrations, they go now Indo-European languages or Aryan languages, they're the most common in the world. And that's mostly due to India, where more people live. You can draw a circle of 1,000 miles. You could pick a location in like Southwest China and then draw a 1,000-mile circle around it. That's where most people in humanity live. Most people in the human race live in South and East Asia. And so Aryan languages are spoken by people in northern India, in Europe and its diaspora, including the Americas, Australia, Russia, and Iran, and the Kurds also speak Aryan languages. And you have other language families like the Semitic languages or the Chinese or Bantu, and those all of those languages were spread at some point by a big migration that related to the discovery of a new way of life. For the Bantu migrations, where most of Africa speaks Bantu languages, it was ironworking and a gene that against malaria. For the Semites, which are the Arabs and the Jews, it always rubbed me the wrong way that people call being anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic, because the most anti-Semitic people in the world are Arabs, who are other Semites. And so it's just a bad terminology. And so the Semites spread around their area from Morocco out to Iraq due to the invention of herding with sheep and cows and all that stuff. For the Aryans, it started around modern Ukraine, and the discovery there was pastoralism. And with that discovery, with pastoralism, the chariot, you see the first rise of nomadic steppe cultures. And from the period from, let's say, 2000 BC until 1700 AD, so for most of history, except the last few centuries, the nomadic steppe in this area of flat grassland with a climate like Nebraska or Iowa, from Romania through Russia, China, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, that whole region produced horrifying warriors. And the Mongols killed 100 million people. The Manchu barbarians killed 30 million people. The Huns killed like 10 million. It's like this video game thing that just spawns out barbarians that attack people. And it wouldn't surprise me if the nomadic tribes killed more people in the pre-industrial world than everyone else combined. And the Aryans were the first wave out of it, and they were the first wave because they got the things that gave the nomads a military advantage first. And we've used archaeology and genetics on this stuff, and so the Aryans were it was this fault line between farming peoples moving up from the Middle East and herding peoples further north up in the grasslands. And it occurred in this geographic hearth area of modern Ukraine, the Caucasus, and Kazakhstan, Western Kazakhstan. It's this area called the Pontic Steppe. And modern Ukraine has a grassland that's kind of comparable to like Illinois, Iowa, the Midwest. It's one of the most fertile places in the world. And the Russians call it the black soil area because the soil there is so fertile that it's just black with nutrients. And so in that area, you saw the mixing of the farming peoples from the Middle East with the local hunter-gatherer peoples who incorporated herding. And fault line cultures tend to be the most advanced, where if your culture is on a kind of fault line between multiple cultures, you can incorporate advantages from different societies at once and then get a strategic advantage from it because you're existing on the edge. And Peter Turchin's run statistical models where he found that the thing that creates empires is being on the edge with a different ethnicity for centuries that forces your people to have a strong us versus them sense, because that sense of like having this foreign force that you have to build up strength against, that's what builds your sense of identity. And through archaeology, and this is a story we mostly know through archaeology, Aryan people, they just looked white. I mean, with a lot of the ancient archaeology and ancient genetics, the racial groups of a long time ago were completely different from today. If you were to go back to Europe in the last ice age, the inhabitants of Europe 20,000 years ago, they were genetically completely different from anyone alive today. Ancient genetics is just a weird rabbit hole. Like, you had people in the current United States 7,000 years ago. There were people in the U.S. who looked like Australian Aboriginals, who looked like Europeans, who looked like Filipinos. The genetic map of the world today is not the genetic map of the world 10,000 years ago. But no, the Aryans who do this, they'd look like white people. And we've done genetics on the populations today that are closest to the Aryan invaders. And this is where the Nazi thing is funny, where the Nazis said that the Germans were the purest Aryans, and that they could conquer the Slavs because the Slavs were less Aryan and thus they were subhuman. Through the genetics, we found the Slavs are more Aryan than the Germans are. And this is my problem with a lot of race science. And I think there is a reality there. It's completely irrefutable that there is an underlying reality. The problem is that whatever metric people make for a political goal is going to end up being wrong. And because the world's just so messy that when you try to fit these sorts of things in a political mold, like if you say that the English are superior to the Irish, or like the upper classes to the lower classes, when you're operating on that level of granularity, we just have no idea. And the populations today that are closest to the original Aryan population are, and these have changed, it's a north-south gradient where North Europeans are closer. So it's the through different studies, it used to be the Muslim populations in Russia, the Tatars, the Finns, and the current system says the Irish. And I'm attached to that result because I'm ethnically Irish, so I'd like that to be true. But genetics results change so much that the results in 5 years are not going to be the results today. And this is one of the things that I really, really hazard humility for people who are studying this topic. That for all of prehistory, and again, this is why this is History 102, not Prehistory 102, that the results change so fast that I have no idea how anyone involved trusts anything that's being said at any given time. But the general pattern we've consistently found in genetics is that the further north you go in Europe, the more the population is Aryan, and the further south, the more it's native population. And so in the British Isles, as an example, the Aryan invaders they genetically wiped out 90% of the native population. And in southern Europe, 2/3 of the native population survived. And the Aryans conquered an area stretching from Ireland out to Bengal. So this huge area of territory from starting out in Ukraine and southern Russia. And the reason in American racial classifications, we call white people Caucasians. And this is something I don't like because it's this like outdated century-old racial designation. And no one calls East Asians Mongoloids, which is the term they had for East Asians at the time. And because the idea they had at the time was that the Aryans came from the Caucasus. And the reality is that they're from an area like 200 miles north of the Caucasus. And one of the weird facts people forget is that white people are native to Central Asia, where if you were to go back to the time of the ancient Romans, the people in Kazakhstan or Western China, they were genetically Europeans. And then over the period of the Roman Empire, the Asians gradually genocided the white population of Central Asia. And so the Chinese records, when China held Central Asia as a colony, they said the people looked white. And the Chinese called white people sunken-eyed ghosts. And they called them floating corpses. Because if you're Chinese, the white people's eyes are sunken back and our skin's very pale. And so the Aryans started out in this place in Central Asia, or they started out in modern Ukraine, and then they migrated out into Central Asia, and that whole area was ethnically European. And Will Durant and a lot of authors from a century ago think that there was an ancient civilization in Central Asia that we've lost records for. And that's the sort of thing that wouldn't surprise me. I don't know if it's true. I mean, Central Asia, every single other river valley system in that area has an ancient civilization. And we have some archaeological records of cities in Central Asia. Interestingly, the Harappan Indian civilization, they had a colony in Central Asia beforehand, like a single city out in Uzbekistan. And the invention that gave the Aryans a significant military advantage was a couple things. The first is that with the invention of pastoralism, and pastoralism's herding, and herding societies have a significantly different culture than non-herding societies. And so if you're in a herding society, you have cows and sheep and horses, and you walk around, and then you kill the animals when you want, you milk them. And so herding societies end up with very masculine, dominant space cultures because you have to constantly express dominance over the animals. And because you're constantly on the move, and there are other herding peoples, is that herding societies prioritize warfare because the only way to know that your cows and sheep are safe is to have a reputation for being such a badass that people won't mess with you. And so, for example, a lot of warrior peoples were herder peoples. The Vikings, the Celts, the ancient Germans, the Mongolians, the Aryans, the Persians, the Arabs, the early Jews. And herding peoples operate off a value system I call pride. And pride is basically you try to build up your sense of, it's an honor-based moral code where you try to build up your sense of pride and self-worth, basically based on how much of a badass you are. And you see this in early America as an example, with the Scots-Irish tribes out in like West Virginia and Appalachia, where if you insult someone's sister, they'll kill you, and then their family will kill you, and then it spirals off into clan warfare. Very much that kind of society. And so you saw the development of herding, and herding gave the local population a geographic mobility that hunter-gatherers or farmers didn't have before. Because farmers are attached to the earth, and in the ancient world, all farming peoples were theocracies because you were terrified that if you didn't please the sun god, that he would mess with you. And so herding peoples have they can produce significantly larger populations. Farming peoples can produce significantly larger populations than herding peoples, but the problem is that the nature of farming gradually domesticates the people in the society. And so what the normal pattern of behavior is that herding peoples will conquer more numerous farming peoples. And so that's why the barbarians coming out of the steppe were constantly conquering outwards. And the Aryans were the first wave of that. And secondly is the chariot. And the chariot is to ancient warfare what the tank is to modern warfare. Where before then, they'd have spearmen and you'd have archers, and it was all foot soldiers. And people couldn't ride the horse at this point, which is something people forget. It took thousands of years of basically genetic engineering to get horses to be big enough that humans could ride them. And we crossbred horses for thousands of years, where we'd breed the bigger horses with other big horses, so that we could finally ride them. But when horses were smaller, you had the ability to attach them to a cart and then use it for geographic mobility. And then people would ride around with these chariots, have arrows, and then fire into enemy formations, charge into enemy formations, and you can't overstate the military importance of the chariot, because it would just be able to completely crush armies of foot soldiers. And so the Aryans invented the chariot, and then they just attacked across the world with it. And they were able to get this huge military advantage over any other people due to the chariot. And the chariot is really what built their conquests. And do you have any questions before I continue?
No, keep going. You're on a roll.
Okay. So there are 3 separate axes I see with the Aryan invasions. There's west into Europe, south into the Middle East, and east into India. And so let's start with Europe and then go east, where the issue continues with archaeologists making complicated terms that normal people don't really need. But through genetics, we found that the Aryans migrated into Europe up the Danube through the corded ware culture. And then we have the beaker culture. The corded ware culture is Central Europe. Then you have the beaker culture in Western Europe. They committed genocide against the population of Northern Europe, where it was genetic replacement across the whole of Northern Europe out to Britain and Ireland. And as I said before, something like 90% of that area's population got wiped out. And keep in mind, the population of Europe at this point was super light. And we've found from archaeology that the Aryans brought the Black Death into Europe at this point. And the Black Death killed at least half of Europe's population, which weakened up the area. And it's pretty comparable to how when the Europeans invaded the Americas, the natives died of diseases. And you can find some interesting parallels there, where for North America, it was genocide of the local population, and for South America, it was mixing with the local population. And there are weird historical synchronicities here, where the North Europeans did to North America what their Aryan ancestors did to North Europe, while the South Europeans did to South America what their Aryan ancestors did to South Europe. And so there was mixing with the local population in South Europe. And I've often thought that the aristocratic character of Greek and Roman civilization stems from the Aryan ruling class taking over and oppressing the local population. That because the ruling class and the lower classes were different populations genetically, that it created this aristocratic character that is the most important aspect of Greek and Roman society. And Europe's on this north-south gradient, where the areas that's most Aryan is around, like, let's say the Muslim Tatars in Russia, the Finns, or the Irish. The furthest north, the least, is Sardinia, where Sardinia, this island off Italy, is genetically basically 0% Aryan. And so the population of Europe they were we call them the mound builders because they were the people who built Stonehenge and Newgrange, and you see these huge like stone structures in Western Europe before the Aryans, and it appears as if they were. First of all, we know nothing about this society. There are no records of them. Everything we're saying is just complete hearsay. It looks like they were a theocracy because they built these enormous religious constructions like Stonehenge again. And we can know that they were pretty advanced because we can tell that they had a trade system that spanned all of Western Europe. And they were just wiped off the face of the map. And Bronze Age Pervert calls them longhouse cultures. He said that they were feminine and weak. I don't know if that's true. It wouldn't surprise me at all. And you do wonder how advanced they were because you look at Stonehenge, and Stonehenge, they were moving multi-ton stones hundreds of miles. A lot of those stones are from like the north. Stonehenge is in the southwest of England. A lot of the stones they're using are from the north of Scotland. And so it's clear they were some level of advanced, but they just got completely wiped out. And ironically, I'm of British and Irish ancestry. Ironically, a modern Italian is genetically closer to the builders of Stonehenge in Britain than the modern British are, because the previous inhabitants, and these aren't the native inhabitants of Europe, the people who were there before the Indo-Aryans, they were people from the Middle East who had genocided the local population, and then the Aryans genocided the top half of them afterwards. And the indigenous inhabitants of Europe, they're a racial group. First of all, I don't really know what indigenous means here, because as I said before, Europe's been genocided 7 times in the last ice age. In just the last ice age. But I have a Y chromosome, or my father's 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 father's, of the indigenous native Europeans. So I can claim to be at least partly genetically them. And so they were a racial group that doesn't exist, but the inhabitants of Europe before the Aryans, they were like basically modern Italians. And the Aryans, we can tell, had a more warlike society, and the biggest Aryan structures we find that they build are like fortresses. And so you move from a culture where the biggest buildings are temples to the biggest buildings are fortresses. And so that signifies a shift from a theocratic society or rule by the priests to a society where a warrior caste rules. And we can trace a lot of this with mythology, and mythology is one of the very few ways that we can actually look at this besides genetics and archaeology, where we find unified mythologies between all the Aryan peoples. And this is something where this is really cool, actually. We've been able to reconstruct what the mythology of the original Aryans were. And we've also been able to reconstruct what the language of the original Aryans were, because we've been able to triangulate from all of these ancient cultures so if the Greeks and the Romans share this, if they share this with the Indians, if they share this with the Lithuanians, then we can figure out through logic what the original religion or language looks like. And so we have a pretty good language model of what they were speaking in Ukraine 4,000 years ago, Proto-Indo-European. And ironically, it's closest to the language of Lithuanian, where Lithuanian is lingually the closest to Proto-Indo-European. I don't know why. And we know that ancestor worship was a very important part of their society. And they had a pantheon that has similarities to the Norse, to the Greeks, to the Indians, and from mythology, we can figure out a lot. Where, for example, in both Greek and in Norse mythology and in Indian mythology, you have the old gods and then you have the new gods. And so the new gods are the Aryan gods, and the old gods are the pre-Aryan religions. And so we think that's the Aesir and the Vanir in Norse mythology. In Celtic mythology, it's the Tuatha De Danann, where in Irish mythology, there were 4 different genocidal invasions of Ireland. And so we think that that's a kind of parallel for the actual demographic history of Ireland, because we know there were a couple different invasions. And the myths about fairies and dryads, elves, and all these ideas of these mythical forest peoples who are older than the humans and they use magic. We think this was some kind of racist stereotype of the indigenous population, where in Ireland, for example, when they found the spear points of the local population, which were made of stone, they would call them fairy points. And so it would be similar to after America conquered the Native Americans, if 1,000 years later, the Native Americans had morphed into this like mythical race that had the ability to ride buffaloes and do magic. So that's how we think those myths started in Europe. You can see that there's a lot of cultural continuity where there's certain traits that you see in Aryan cultures. And we know that these traits exist because they're shared between the Indians, the Persians, and the Europeans. And one of them is military aggressiveness. Another one is a sense that there is a single truth that we should aim towards, that you should search for. The idea, philosophy also stems from these kinds of cultures, and an idea. So they're warband based cultures rather than farming based cultures. And so you can look at European society and you can see these very old these traits that European societies have until today, and they exist 4,000 years ago. And I like to say that a lot more of the things that we know about today are vastly older than any of us think, where lots of cultural differences, I mean, let's say the Chinese and the Europeans, go back to this time period, and they're not in any way recent things. It's funny. Part of me feels like I'm going to get accused of being racist against societies that haven't existed in 4,000 years. Because I was talking about the Italian indigenous inhabitants of Europe, and I was wondering, is anyone going to get triggered? And I'm thinking, the people who would get triggered were killed before Moses lived. That is how the past works. Like, there's a lot of apologists for Genghis Khan, and Genghis Khan is the greatest mass murderer in history. But everyone he killed was 800 years ago. And so you're not going to have like a bunch of Chinese people saying my grandma died because of Genghis Khan. It's one of the things Dan Carlin talks about, that the further you go back into history, people forget about how inhumane you are, and then they remember the positives. Like, people like Julius Caesar, but we forget Julius Caesar killed a third of modern France's population, and he enslaved. I think he killed a third and he enslaved another third. I might be making those numbers up, but I think so.
You're going to call racist for drinking tea, whatever, milk, or whatever you're drinking. Yeah. Racist for breathing.
I'm glad society has gone in this direction, that we've watered down the meaning of the term racist and offense so much, because we can have conversations like this now. I can talk at this event that happened 4,000 years ago that has historic relevance, and no one's going to care.
I wonder if we're going to do the same thing for fascists too, because it feels like that term just gets thrown around for everything people don't like. Everyone I don't like is literally Hitler, and so it's going to lose its power because when you're calling Jews Hitler, it gets a little confusing.
Yeah, exactly. My friend J-Reg makes the whole clip. He makes this whole meme about, he said the Russians are Nazis, the Ukrainians are Nazis, the Jews are Arabs. Sorry, the Jews are Nazis, the Arabs are Nazis, the Republicans are Nazis, the Democrats are Nazis. And the irony is that if someone's a legitimate fascist, you don't have anything to say. I mean, like, I think there are people who are legit Nazis on the right, and I, as a person on the right, I view it as kind of my responsibility to hold them accountable. But I mean, these things have been warped to the point that they don't have meaning anymore. To get back to the time period, so after Europe, we are going to get to the only place in this time period that has records. And for just a tangent, there's this book called 1421, which is written by Gavin Menzies about why he thinks the Chinese discovered America. And my father, so the way Gavin Menzies, he has the Chinese sailing around the world everywhere except Europe. And my father would joke, look, he drew a map of everywhere that doesn't have records. And I think Gavin Menzies is paid for by the Chinese government, but different story. So the Middle East, as I said at the start of the video, had these ancient, already 1,000-year-old civilizations by the time the Aryans showed up. And the Aryans attacked south, and they formed the modern Armenians and the modern Persians, and they conquered modern Turkey, called the Hittites. And so they were fronting up on... So the way the Middle East worked at this time period is you had the Fertile Crescent, watch the Mesopotamia video, and then that was where civilization was. And then north of the Fertile Crescent were these mountains, and the Aryans populated the mountains, and Persia was historically irrelevant for the time period we're talking about. Persia later on in the ancient world became the biggest empire up to that point in history. But know that the Persians are there at least. And the Hittites were one of the most important empires of the Bronze Age, and they were Aryans. And I've actually been to the Hittite capital outside Ankara. It's called Hattusas. And it was funny walking around Hattusas, where this was the New York City of the ancient world, or it's the Shanghai of the ancient world. 3,000 years ago, Hattusas was one of the great world cities. And when I was there, it was all ruins, and then there were sheep, and there was a village a few miles away. And so it's funny that like the New York City of 3,000 years ago was completely irrelevant, and we were the only tourists there. And I just remember, I think to myself, this is going to be Los Angeles in 3,000 years. I do think New York City will still be a city in 3,000 years, but I don't think Los Angeles will. New York City's got better geography, and so that was a humbling experience for me. And so the Hittites were based out of Turkey. They were one of the biggest empires of the Bronze Age. They had a lot of wars with the Egyptians, and they fell apart due to the Sea People Bronze Age collapse. And this stuff belongs more so in a Bronze Age video if I ever get around to making that. There was also an Aryan kingdom in northern Iraq called Mitanni. And Mitanni, they were a ruling class for the local population. And it is interesting that you look at this time period, and there was this huge historic event, one of the biggest in history. The Aryan invasions, they might be the largest largest series of invasions ever in history in geographic scope, barring the European colonial empires, if you want to count all the European colonies as one. And the Middle Easterners didn't really notice because their sense of it's just the ancient world's going to do ancient world things. People's sense of the world was smaller. And finally, the final area that the Indo-Aryan invasions took place in is India. And in India, it's an interesting parallel for Europe. In Europe, it was the genocide and wipeout of the local population, where we don't even have place names for the local population in Europe. And a sense of how crazy that is there are basically no Native Americans left. Native Americans are 0.5% of America's genome, where most people who claim to be Native Americans, 1% of Americans claim to be Native Americans, and less than half of that ancestry is actual Native American. But keep in mind, most states in America have Native American place names. And so America wiped out the natives, there are still native place names. There are no native place names in Europe. That is a level of cultural destruction that's hard to even comprehend. That didn't happen in India. And Europe has a temperate climate. It's filled with white people who look like the Aryans, who are also white people. In India, it's filled with brown people, and it's a jungle climate, and there's disease. And so you end up with all these different incentive structures in India vis-a-vis Europe. Where the Aryans weren't able to replace the local population. And thus, from this, you saw the arrival of the caste system, where in India, and there's a bunch of ideas for why this might have happened. One of it is genetic, where the local Indians in Europe, the Aryans had the genetic advantage. They were the people with the diseases that killed half of the local population. In India, the locals were the ones with the diseases. So the Aryans couldn't outbreed the local population. So we think that the caste system, and for those who want to know more, watch the video on ancient India. In India, there's a system where each social class is a self-contained ethnic group where they're not allowed to breed together. They're not allowed to have kids outside of their group. They're not allowed to cook meals with people outside of their group. In a lot of cases, they're not even allowed to look at each other. And it's crazy that from genetics, we found that these castes have not outbred for over 2,000 years. And that's just unheard of genetically. And the caste system is this, it's one of the strangest cultural formations anthropologically around the world. It's strange the Indians maintained it. It's strange it happened. But what a reasoning for this, and the things the caste system is most obsessed about, is eating, cleanliness, and sex. And so these are things that spread genes and germs. And so we think that the caste system developed to keep the Aryan population physically away from the local populations. They wouldn't get their diseases. It's similar. Whenever you see races mix, you end up with caste systems. America has a caste system between whites and blacks. South and Central America have one. That happened. And in India, something interesting happened, where in Europe, the local gods were kind of shoved into obscurity, where they survived on as fairies and dwarves and dryads and forest spirits. And we think also in Europe that the psychedelic cults are pre-Aryan, like Dionysus. And in India, it was this struggle between the imported Aryan gods and the local gods, where first the Aryan gods dominated, and then over time, the local gods beat them. And the reason that India is a society run by the priests rather than the warriors like Europe is that the priests, as I said before, farming populations in the ancient world were theocracies. Herding populations were warrior societies. So because the local population outnumbered the Aryans, the priests allied with the local populations against the Aryans. And so over ancient Indian history, we've seen the gradual decline of the Aryans as a demographic vis-a-vis the local population. And India is I think it's a little bit over 50% Aryan speaking language, and the other half is the Dravidian languages. And interestingly, the wealthiest parts of India are not the Aryan parts. The wealthiest parts are the far south in Tamil. And that's kind of a monkey wrench for a lot of the racist Nazi era theories that the Aryans were what made India great. But India is fascinating because it takes all these things, these Aryan traits from Europe in a different direction, where you could do this with the Middle East too, where in Europe, the Aryan culture morphed into science and reason. In India, the exact same impulse went into religion, where Indian religion is scientific, where it uses all the same logical structures as science in the West. It just uses them for religion. In the Middle East, you saw those same variables go into the creation of a different religion. And so Aryan culture in India created Hinduism eventually. Aryan culture in the Middle East created Zoroastrianism. And then in Europe, it created the ancient Greek and the Roman gods, and Platonism. So it's why you see a lot of similarities in Plato's philosophy and between Hinduism. And And so for all of these, there's lots of, when you deal with a historic event this big, it leaves with lots of different threads. So if you guys are interested, you have a bunch of videos you can watch. You can watch the Greek civilization video, the Indian civilization video. We'll probably make a Persia video. But after basically, I was going to say that the Aryans metaphorically ejaculated over Eurasia, but it's not metaphorical. Look at their genetics. They literally did so. And so basically, the Aryans spread their seed across the entire continent of Eurasia. And it's again, this is that event right before the veil of history. So the point I want to finish on, finish. The point I want to leave on is that if this thing happened and we only barely know about it, this is the biggest conquest in history before European colonialism. We only barely know about it. What else don't we know about? Because maybe there was an Alexander the Great 10,000 years ago. And let me remind you that in India didn't really have records until the Muslims showed up 1,000 years ago. And so there were multiple conquerors who we know conquered all of North India, and we only have barely any evidence for them. And so it really begs the question, and I do wonder, because I made a list for each History 102 episode, who is the most important figure for that time period. And for this time period, I just don't know. It was probably some guy who, I'm sure there were great conquerors in this time period who we've just completely forgotten about. And so I guess I just want to leave this video with a sense of wonder and awe about the world.
I think that's a great place to wrap. Is there any other recommendations or things you want?
So this is not a time period where it's like easy to get books on, and so like there are barely any authors on this topic, and that's my issue with the Bronze Age in general. It's one of those things where, like, for all the time and effort we put into a handful of stupid topics, if we just doubled the amount of books in the Bronze Age, like, it would help out that time period study so much. This book by David Reich, this is one of the best books I've read. It looks at genetics and encodes. It looks at genetics and it rewrites history. And there's a lot of cool stuff. Like over the last 10 years, we found out that there were at least 3 or 4 groups of early human that we never knew about from genetics. Or another thing is that we found, this is actually a really cool point I forgot, that we found that there are 10 historic figures who lived in the Bronze Age who had genetic. So you know how Genghis Khan slept with thousands of women, and so like tens of millions of people are descendants of Genghis Khan. There are at least 10 figures of that scale in the Bronze Age who we don't know about.
Wow.
So what that means is we had 10 figures who basically fucked around as much as Genghis Khan, conquered, who must have been great conquerors, who we don't know. I mean, it's Conan the Barbarian. Conan the Barbarian, written by a Texan. It's about this ancient warrior king who was just a Chad who conquered stuff and went on adventures. And the author said it's set in the world before the Aryan. So it's exactly that sort of thing. Samo Berja, one of my favorite things he said, the ancient world had more in common with Conan the Barbarian than most like prehistory textbooks. I think that's true. I have not read this book. It looks kind of boring, but I guess it probably has the info. Comparative mythology. This book is... it's pretty good. It's ancestral journeys. It's the genetics of Europe. I have another book on the genetics of India I forgot to bring. And there's another book called The Horse and the Saddle and the whatever. It's the first book you look up on the Aryans and Amazon. It's not a good book. It's like The Horse, the Saddle, and Language. And so that's the history of the Aryans.
That's a great place to wrap. This is a great overview. And until next time.
And see you next time. Next topic is the Dark Ages.
Perfect.
Peace.